Good morning. I want to thank everybody who joins us in Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform. My name is Olga Gonchevska, and I'm happy to see in the Brain Hub, a main discussion platform in Ukraine. It's day 505 of the full-scale invasion of a homeland by Russian aggressor, and today we have invited you to talk about a very important topic. We will be talking about the women's cells in the torture chambers in Kherson. We know that the occupiers during the occupation of Kherson were detaining 30 of our women in a confinement cell of the Department of the National Police of Kherson region, and our human rights analysts from ZMINA human rights group were talking to the witnesses of those events, and during our today's event we will present the report about how the events were unfolding, how the women were detained in those confinement cells. We will be talking about tortures, and today we have joined both human rights specialists and the witnesses of those events during our today's press conference. So I want to introduce our speakers today. It's Onisia Sinyuk, legal analyst of ZMINA Human Rights Group, and Nataliya Okhotnikova, human rights advisor of ZMINA Human Rights Group. Joining us online will be Olga Gonchevska, former employee of the Patrol Police Department in Kherson region, who was illegally detained in the confinement cell for more than 1.5 months. Also joining us online will be Nataliya Sosmii, cadet of the Kozheduba Kharkiv National Air Force University, who was also illegally detained in the confinement cell. And also joining us online is Alexander Zeus from Prosecutor General's office, and Alexander Golubtsov, the prosecutor of the Kherson Regional Prosecutor's Office. So let's start our conversation with you, Ms. Onisia. What have you managed to study? What were the conditions our women were held in? Please. Thank you very much. Yes, you mentioned it correctly, that as a result of our conversations with the witnesses, we spent like 10 hours of interviews with the witnesses, and we identified about 30 women who were detained in a confinement cell in Kherson during different periods. So yes, they were detained during different periods. Some of them were detained there up to for 3 months. Some of them were detained for an hour or so. Also, we have to understand that the majority of them were detained in July, August, and all the way until October, until the Russian troops started withdrawing from Kherson. And as the witnesses called it, they established an amnesty procedure for those who were held in a confinement cell. However, several people were forcibly relocated to other occupied territories. For example, 4 women were relocated to Novopristan and Novotroitsk further on. Fortunately, they were all let go, and 3 of them made it back to the Ukrainian-controlled territory. When we talk about the circumstances and reasons for detention, as well as the groups that were detained, there are certain tendencies that can be traced. For example, special attention was paid to the women who were either the service persons of the national police or were suspected by the Russian representatives to be associated with the resistance movement in occupied territories, and to suppress that resistance movement, those women were detained. So talking about the confinement conditions, they were all in violation of human rights, and in violation of international humanitarian law, as well as the circumstances of detention that do not comply with the legal detention procedures. For what the witnesses reported, it started with the fact that they were not informed about the reason for detention. Three witnesses said they were not communicated any single reason for the visit of the representatives of the Russian Federation, and the other ones said that they were detained under other premises like inspection of passports, paperwork, IDs, and so on and so forth, without producing any official documents. On top of that, the women were not told where they will be moved. Moreover, during the detention, the women were experiencing violence in the regard, and one of the women was brought to the confinement cell with the hematomes on her head. Well, talking about the conditions of detention, we have to understand that the confinement cell is fit for detention of the people, but the way that the Russian representatives were detaining people in there were not considered as a fit conditions. For example, all the 3 cells where women were detained were fit for 2 or maximum 3 people. When the mentioned women were detained there, sometimes the number of people in a cell was reaching 9 persons, and the average number was 5 to 6 persons per cell. We understand they did not have enough space, even to make themselves more or less comfortable in those cells, and those who had previous health problems, such problems were deteriorated because they had to sleep on the floor without any mats or mattresses. On top of that, the hygienic conditions were horrible. First, women were detained for about 21 days. They did not have shower for all of that period. Later, a schedule for showering was established, but it meant 5 minutes for all of the women. This is how they were allowed to take showers. Then that schedule was unstable, and it was at the discretion of the person who was managing the Russians, Andriy Zly. Sometimes he was deciding to let women to shower every day, and then sometimes it was once in 5 days. The ratios were also unstable. Sometimes women were fed only once per day. Then there was a rotation of the military. The first Russians who were supervising those detained were the representatives of Russian Guard, and then they got rotated, and upon the witnesses of the victims, we realized, we may suspect that they were rotated with the representatives of the Russian Federation Prosecutor's office, because their food was brought for them in the morning, and the ratios they were getting in the evening were sour. For example, the women who were sitting in a 21st cell, they were getting food the first, and they were redistributing it in a way so that the other ones have enough food for them left. There was no medical assistance, no medical aid. The only doctor who was allowed to visit the victims was a manual therapist who was one of the detainees. Also, there was a doctor coming from the occupied territories and who said that everybody who had any complaints, they were simulating it. Then when we talk about tortures, we were able to document the cases of torture in regard to 5 women. The tortures were used against those women who were suspected to be affiliated with the law enforcement agencies or with the resistance movement in the occupied territories. And the most widespread torture type was beating, electrocution, and different tortures using water, sometimes combined. When I'm saying water, the water was poured straight into their mouth, or sometimes a piece of fabric was put over their heads, and when such fabric gets wet, it doesn't let the air through. Well, in case of electrocution, we documented one case of sexualized electrocution when the electrodes were attached to the breast of a victim. Also, it's important to mention that we could trace a pattern of a sexualized and sexual violence. The threats and comments regarding the sexual violence were used by the Russian military right away, starting from the very moment of detention and further on, and they were not concealed in any way. We understand that it's a part of the culture of the Russian military because those threats were pronounced in presence of other representatives of Russian Federation or other victims, so it's not something that they could be punished for by their commanders further on. So during the moment of detention, the women were forced to undress. 3 of the victims were witnessing that they were told to undress during detention, and when they were asked to put the bra back on, they were told that they should do it just within 1 minute, or otherwise the Russians would break out the door into the room where she was dressing. Then there was a case of rape when 15 Russian military were detaining one woman. They encircled her as soon as they brought her to the confinement cell, and then they started, so to say, inspecting her or examining her, giving comments about the violence, and then a victim was threatened to be raped, and just as well as her minor daughter, who was also threatened to be raped. And a part of the general atmosphere in the confinement cell, there was a component of psychological torture that was applied 24/7. One of the women's cells had windows looking to the courtyard where everybody was brought and systemically beaten, and another cell was right on top of the venue where other people were tortured all the time, and they were hearing the sounds of those tortures 24/7, and that torture was going on in open cells so that everyone else hears what's going on. Yet another case was that some of the victims were put in the cells right in front of those where their close ones or their friends were staying, and they were tortured in the presence of each other. So I want to quote one of the victims here. A husband of a victim was tortured in a cell right in front, and she was trying to make out the yell of her husband among other yells. So have you ever heard your husband yelling out of pain? So it was going 24/7, and they were forced to listen to those cries. And on top of psychological torture, another factor was the lack of understanding how long the women would be staying there. They didn't know what was the term of detention. They didn't know about the further detention, when they were let out to walk, somewhere they were put a bag on the head so they don't see where they're being headed. And talking about the consequences for those who were let go from the confinement cell, we have to understand when after the 3 months of such detention, there are both physical consequences and psychological consequences. All the victims witnessed about the deterioration of their health, back aches after sleeping on the floor, loss of weight up to 6 kilograms due to improper ratios. And one of the victims said their hair started falling off as a result of the stress. The victims had constant paranoia. They were afraid that they could be detained once again, or that they were let go just to get in touch with someone else, because sometimes they were kept hostages just to reach out to other people, and they were only let go when those persons were detained. Well, it's horrible. It's horrible to imagine the level of that torture. I was kept in a confinement cell since August 4 until September 26, and then on September 26 I was put in another confinement cell where I spent another month in a single cell. And regarding my detention, I was detained with my civil husband, who is a former law enforcement officer. We were detained upon the lead of our former colleague. I was considering him a friend that we were communicating with, so we were visited in the apartment that we were renting. It was an address that was not mentioned anywhere, not even the address of our registration. We were thinking we could spend some time there because it was closer to the occupation. We were hoping to make it by the occupation, but it didn't happen. So they knocked on our door. It was 2 men wearing civil clothing. They said it was a passport examination, and I handed over our passports without any suspicion, because we were living just by the building of the department of the police and where we were serving before. So I was thinking that Russians, they have a tendency of inspecting the area just near the stationing location, and when they inspected our passports, they pulled out their arms and they told us we are detained and we should walk outside, facing outside of our apartment, facing the wall, hands up. They started making a video of that. They asked us to introduce ourselves, and they asked us whether we know what we are detained for. And I said that probably because we are maybe a former police officer. They said nothing in response. They asked whether we had weapons, and it didn't make any sense to say that we had nothing. We said yes, we have weapons. They brought us back to the apartment. They put the husband on the floor with his hands tied with the duct tape. They brought me to the kitchen and started informing me that we are detained, that starting from the 1st July 2022 in Kherson region the Russian Federation laws are in effect, and if we don't know it, it's our problem. We should have turned in the weapons to them. We have read about it, but obviously no one was going to do that, so we were informed we were detained for that reason. There is a criminal case opened in our regard according to the law of Russian Federation, but they never informed me where we were going, for what reason we were going that way, and after the inspection they deprived us of 3 cell phones, 2 notebook computers. They took my car away. Everything was fortunately returned, apart from one of the notebook positions, which they said was damaged during artillery shelling of their positions, and it was for an indefinite term. We were not able to understand anything. The situation was deteriorated by the fact that my husband, he was a former serviceman. They put a special accent on that he was an enemy of a Russian person. This told me, like, we can make do with you, but he's almost dead now. And so they were pressing on us that way. It was way more difficult. They were pressing on that fact that they would never let him go, and you can do nothing about that. So we were brought to the confinement cell. We were brought in different trucks. They let us gather some minimum amount of things with us, but when you don't understand what is the period that you're going there for, in that situation you don't even start thinking what do you need. You're not going for a vacation. The first thing that came up to my mind, I put it all in my bag. We also had a dog, 4 months old. They've seen it right away, because again there were 2 people wearing civil clothing, and then there were about 15 more clad in the Russian uniforms. They've seen me being very attached to my dog, and they said they would take it away. They needed that specific dog, not any other one. But thanks God we were able to hand the dog over to my parents, but they were pressing me, telling me that they would take the dog away. When I was brought to a confinement cell, they asked me, who told you that people get beaten here? No one gets beaten here. Everything is fine here. Don't get concerned. So again, we were put in different cells. Me and my husband. I remember I heard them tell my husband that they would not get him any parcels. He was not allowed to get any parcels, only I was allowed to get them. And as I got to the cell, it was cell 21, which was fit for 2 women. There were 2 women already in there. One of them was sleeping on the mattress on the floor, so there was another bunk that I've taken, but for that moment the mattresses were enough. However, in the morning there was another woman brought in, and yet another one, and then it turns out it's 7 or 8 of us in that confinement cell. And during the investigation experiment that was taking place recently, I've walked in that same cell. I've seen that it's fit for 2 women, and I don't even imagine now how we were making it all 7, but our goal was to survive. Our goal was to see our parents, to see each other again. And I was thinking about the number of the people in the cell, the list, but again I can corroborate the words that were pronounced before. The ratios sometimes were coming once per day. Obviously that was not enough, but due to the stress, your body, it may not even need that amount of food. We were eating because we had to eat. It was impossible to eat that food, actually. Well, as long as it was fresh, we could eat it. But in my personal case, my goal was to survive and not to think about food. Yes, about the hygiene, yes, we were asking, we had to ask them to get us to the shower, but it was not a full-fledged shower. When we had such opportunity, we were heating the water in the bottles and we were washing each other using the water from the bottles. We had to support the hygienic regime one way or another. And then my mother told me that they tried to hand over some shampoos to me, but the Russians said just let her use the soap to wash her head, so they didn't. So for them, it didn't make any difference. Then we had conversations with people who were detaining me. They were threatened with physical impact on me. They were pressing on me psychologically. They told me they will cut my hair. They would deport my parents from Kherson to Mykolaiv. And then when I was not able to provide the information that they were in need of, they told me just sit and think more, and that more was like 1 week, and you sit there in the cell and you don't know, oh, is it good or bad that they come for you once again, and you just sit in that cell and you hear the people being tortured, the new people who were coming again and again, and it's another measure of psychological influence. You're not being touched, but you realize where you stay, and you don't know whether you will be able to make it out. So on 18th of August, they came for me. They brought me to the ground floor. I thought that would be another conversation with them, but as soon as I was brought into the room, I've sat on the wet chair. I didn't pay attention to it because I was thinking I could expect anything there. I was not allowed to take off the hat. And then I've seen through the fiber of the head, I've seen the military uniform, I've seen something's going wrong. And they told me, now you're gonna tell us everything. So they started asking me about some operators from Security Service of Ukraine, from Western Ukraine, but I had no affiliation with any such agencies. So they put a shocker to my leg. They electrified me for one single time, and they said it's only the beginning, so you better tell us everything yourself. So I had no choice, and I couldn't tell them anything. So as long as they were looking for some piece of fiber, they said you have still time to tell us everything. Then they put my head off, put my head up, and they told me, you're beautiful, we wouldn't like to torture you, however we have no choice. And they said, of course we understand that in Ukraine you don't usually beat the women, but our hands are untied. I don't know why they said it, whether they were not understanding what they were saying or they were feeling proud about it. So then I realized that when they've brought that rag, they put it on my face and they started pouring water over my face, and when they realized when I'm on the brink of losing conscious, they said like, okay, come on, say something, but in that case you're trying to inhale, but the fabric doesn't let the air through, so you're suffocating, and you're telling them I have nothing to say, I don't know anything, and they started all anew again and again, plus they attached me to the chair with the scotch tape, so I had handcuffs on my hands, and they used the scotch on top of it, but I tore the scotch and they put me on the floor. One was holding my hands, one of them was holding my legs, and the third one was pouring water onto my face. I was trying to break out. It was my natural instinct of survival. I had my back scratched and they kept pouring water onto my face, and as soon as they've seen that I cannot tell them anything, well, for them it was better than lies detector, and they said that lies detector is gibberish. This is the real lies detector. And then they told me, like, go back to your cell and think, and we're gonna get back for you. I don't remember how they brought me back. I just remember that I was all wet, my cell was opened, and the women who were in my cell, they've seen me and they were all shocked. They asked me, Olga, what's happened? And I didn't know what to tell them. I asked them for a sheet of paper and a pen so I could write a note for my parents. And I said, that's it. I'm not gonna make it. Stas, my husband, I told him, please tell my parents anything I will write in that note. The women started comforting me that it's gonna be alright and stuff like that, but I didn't want to change my clothes. I just wanted to write a couple of last words for my parents. Then I started coming back to my senses. The girls started supporting me. This is what we were doing. We were supporting each other, because otherwise we would just go insane there. So they made my hair, because I was absolutely unable to get a grip of myself. They got me a tranquilizer. I got a bottle of water to drink, but I was holding that bottle of water in my hand and I realized that I cannot drink. I thought, no, I can't, they cannot break my side. I shouldn't get that trauma. And then I resorted to medical aid because I was not feeling the tips of my fingers. And the manual therapist, the doctor who was present there, he told me that this is something that can happen, but I cannot. He provided me with some medicines. I appreciate what he did, but it was not real medical aid. And the fact that he had some Medicaid that was stolen from the parcels, I'm happy he was able to help me with that Medicaid. But then after that case, there were no tortures against me. The Russians realized that they can do nothing about it, and they brought me to the regional police department, where there was an investigator who told me that there was a case initiated against me according to the law of Russian Federation, which, as they said, were way stricter than the Ukrainian laws. But there was a counteroffensive by Ukrainian armed forces going on quite actively. We knew about it from other girls that were brought into the confinement cell. We knew that our land was about to be liberated, so I was hoping that it was about to be over soon. I told them, like, all right, criminal case is criminal case. I can do nothing about it, and in fact I could not. I was just thinking that Kherson was about to be liberated shortly and it would be over soon. Unfortunately, it did not happen so soon. 3 weeks after the interrogation, I was convoyed to a confinement cell with my husband. There was another man with us, and they were keeping me in that confinement cell. There were no Russian military there were only our collaborationists, our former servicemen, and the attitude was more adequate there. However, I cannot say that the detention conditions were good, because I was detained just for nothing, and on the 20th of October, I was let go together with my husband. Well, we were let go just against the obligation of not leave. We changed the address of our residence because we were in fear that we could be kidnapped once again, because the evacuation was going on. When we found out that they evacuated the confinement cell, we realized that they could come for us again, and we were hiding all the way until the liberation of Kherson. I told my parents that if it happens to me again, don't count on me fighting for my life. I thought my resources were exhausted during the period of my detention. I was able to find some inner force to make it for the next day, because I have no choice. Miss Olga, thank you very much for leaving, for sharing your cruel memories, so horrific memories. Also joining us online is Miss Nataliya, who also survived this type of horrific experience. Miss Nataliya, if you're hearing us, please let us know. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Well, I've heard what the previous speaker said. I have tears coming into my eyes. I'm sorry. I'm going to be switching to Russian sometimes. So my name is Nataliya, and as I was detained by Russian federals, I was a cadet of Kharkiv National Air Force University, named after Ivan Kozheduba. I was about to graduate on this August 30, but in the evening, at 9:30 in the evening, I was visited. I was cleaning my phone in the kitchen. I was gathering my things. I was about to leave to the Ukrainian controlled territory. On the very next day, our colonel got in touch with me, and he told me I would have to leave to finish my study, to graduate, and then enlist with the armed forces of Ukraine. So we were in touch with the colonel. He told me to get in touch with those cadets who were staying in Kherson, whether they would be able to leave and to finish their studies. Since I was a journalist, I got in touch with those guys who were staying in Kherson, and I asked not their opinion, but I'm sorry, I'm nervous. I've just asked them whether they were going to go with me, and Alexander, one of the guys, he told me that he would not go because his mother was ill. Dmitry, Naroda, he was thinking whether to go or not, and our commander, also his name is Dmitry, so he came to me just to meet me in the evening. So we started communicating, and as soon as he left his car, I asked him, Dima, haven't you changed? I don't know why I've asked him. And so he treated me with the coffee. We got back into a car, and I think that further on he was recording our conversation about what I would be going to do as soon as I leave Kherson. How do I get enlisted with the armed forces, and what do I do to those people? How do I like them, or how do I hate them? I called them orcs. I realized that our conversation was recorded, and my phrases were repeated to me when I was kept in that confinement cell, so I understand it clearly that people could not just say it in the same way as I did during that conversation with Dmitry in that car. So I think he was recording me. So we after that conversation, he said he still didn't know whether he would go or not, whether we would rather use one car or go in other separate cars. It could be dangerous or not. So on the 31st of August, I was about to leave, and Dmitry had to visit me in the morning. So we were supposed to go together, but Dmitry has never arrived. And the driver, he told me that he didn't have a SIM card that he could use, and he used another SIM card to get in touch with the driver, and then he said that the travel was postponed. I got agitated. I put the things and documents on the floor. That there were money, passports, documents. I had money put away, 44,000 for chemotherapy for my father-in-law that I had to hand over to his hospital for his further treatment. Then I had money for the travel, and as I walked out to the kitchen, I've heard something going on in the yard. I've heard their conversation, where they were going, that they were about to break in. I turned the lights on, and they started yelling, "Russian guard, FSB, open the door or we'll break it." And I realized that my whole life is laying there on the floor, so I asked the father to open the door. He was at home back then, and meanwhile father was opening the door. I was trying to hide the things. So about 15 people broke into our home. They started searching the rooms. They started searching, I know, and they put me in the furthermost room where the things were, and I don't remember what number of people was in there. And the first question they asked me, "What is your affiliation with Nikolai Sapuka?" And I've realized what's going on, more or less. Natalia, what was going on in that institution you were brought in? What were the conditions of your detention? Yes, so those people, they've never introduced themselves. They just said they're from Russian Guard. They didn't inform me what I'm being charged of. They just told me that I'm a representative of the Security Service of Ukraine, that I'm a double agent. This is what they told my father. So they put a hat on my head and they just took me out of my home. I was wearing my night suit and they were my pajamas, and they told me just change, and we're about to be going. I asked them to leave the room so I could change, but they never did it, so I had to change in their presence. And the father asked me where did they took me, and they said that they were taking me for like 2 days only. They took my telephones away, they took my tablet, money and documents away, they took away everything. So they put me in the car and they brought me to Tavrichesky district. I had to get a bag with me to hand over to another woman who was going to Zhytomyr. It was one of the cadets. We were in touch with her, so we were driving all around the city. I think that we were visiting Dmitry, who was supposed to come to my place. So I was feeling not well. They gave me water and they brought me to that building. Again, they told me to remove all the strings, all the shoelace, all the belts, the gold, everything, and to turn it all to them. So I was encircled by around 10 men. They started pulling my t-shirt, they started removing my pants. They told me like, "You're gonna make a good wife, we're about to rape you." you're gonna serve our military and stuff like that. So they were touching me with their dirty hands. They were pushing me around, and then they brought me to the cell where I was about to faint because I was realizing what it could all end with, and there were already 4 people inside that cell number 12. The cell was fit for 2 persons only. Well, to say that we were in bad conditions compared to other ones, we had a VIP room because there was a shower and lavatory in our cell. We had 3 times a day food. Sometimes it was hot in the summer and the food was getting sour. We were asking for more bread. We started drying the bread because just in case, because we were understanding that today we get food and tomorrow we may not be getting it. So everybody was preparing that either we will be executed before the liberation or we should run away. We were taken for interrogation, we were fingerprinted, taken pictures of, and during each and every moment they were repeating me that they would find my child, they would rape them and deport to Crimea. And as I was interrogated, they were just preparing me because I was not an active service person, but rather a cadet. They told me that they would bring me to the Crimea, and then I would be brought to Donbass front lines where I would be shot by Ukrainian soldiers. And the women who were staying in my cell, they were surprised because I was taken to interrogation way more frequently than other ones, and during my written explanations the investigator was telling me he was striking everything out. He told me like everything is wrong, and then he just wrote it down on the paper and told me to learn it by heart. And he said we would make a movie with you. I asked about what kind of movie it was, it would be about, and he said it would be a movie about us liberating you from Kherson. So I've realized that if I don't make it out before the referendum, and if I sign those papers, it would be very difficult to prove anybody that I did not commit high treason. So I was pressed upon, but I decided that I should make it out before the referendum. I had panic attacks, and every time when I was interrogated, they told me that they would take away, they would deport and rape my child, and they would execute my parents. Natalia, thank you very much for sharing your story with us, joining us, other representatives of our law enforcement system. I'm reminding you that we have Alexander Zus joining us, a representative of the Prosecutor General's office. Mr. Alexander, could you identify the perpetrators? What is the condition of the case? I mean, the perpetrators in the case that we were talking about just now. Mr. Alexander got disconnected. 1, 2. Alexander Holoptsov. Mr. Alexander, are you with us? Yes, I'm with you. Yes, can you hear me? So yes, meanwhile, let's talk with you. Joining us is the prosecutor of the Kherson Regional Prosecutor's Office. Mr. Alexander, can you maybe answer those questions? Were you able to identify the perpetrators of that crime? What is the condition of investigation? Yes, after the occupation of the city and the reestablishment of physical access to the confinement cell, the law enforcement took a number of steps to identify the perpetrators in the crime. They identified the victims, and the victims, we gathered the evidences, including biological materials, and the work that was done proved its result. There is the conviction of three Russian commander and 3 of his subordinates regarding the cruel tortures of the civilians. I'm talking about the Russian police colonel and 3 Russian servicemen. They are accused of violation of the laws of war. It was identified that they were staying in Kherson since March 2022, and upon the orders of Russian commander, his subordinates were detaining and torturing people with proactive Ukrainian positions, ATO veterans, volunteers, and relatives of the Ukrainian law enforcement officers. We still have work going on in regard of other persons, those who switched sides, collaborationists who were executing the criminal orders. I'm sure we will find all those guilty and no criminal will avoid punishment. Very interesting, Mr. Alexander, regarding the collaborationists that we've heard about from our witnesses. So what is the condition of the lawsuits against the collaborationists? For the time being, we identified 6 persons who switched sides, who collaborated with the enemy. 4 of them are former police servicemen. So we are currently inspecting the we're examining the information about their affiliation with the collaborationists. Are any of those cases brought to the court? Yes, just as I mentioned, the case was brought to Kherson Regional Court for consideration with regard of 4 servicemen. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. If we have any questions on the floor, please join our conversation. Do we have any questions on the floor? Well, we have no questions. Thank you very much. Thank you. Maybe you have some comments, Miss Nataliya? Thank you very much. It's really very difficult after all that information from the brave women who made it out. So what we've seen in the report is the witnesses of the victims that brought us to the conclusions that it was a systemic, wide-scale campaign that Russians, the representatives of different law enforcement units, and what we've seen not only in Kherson region, that was a systemic campaign against our Ukrainian population, our civilians, and with the purpose of intimidation, as it was already mentioned, identification of pro-Ukrainian citizens, and we see it as not only the crime, the war crime, but also when we've checked this report and our previous reports regarding the cruel attitude and violent abductions after the interviews in Kiev, Kherson, Kharkiv regions, we've realized that there is a systemic nature in that process and a broad scale of this process. The systemic nature is witnessed by the fact that different units that were located in different areas, for example, today we were hearing information about the Kherson region, so their actions, they were as if they were in compliance with some procedure, so it was not accessed by the performers on spots. And about the broad scale, today we're talking about the city of Kherson, but those places were numerous, unfortunately, and our partners from Ukraine 5 AM coalition, along with our organization, we document all those evidences that we may further on hand over to all possible institutions. Currently, the information in the report is about the improper conditions of detention and improper feeding, and in case we have permits from the victims, because it's emotionally difficult, some of them are still staying in temporarily occupied territories. So we intend to hand over those evidences to the Security Service of Ukraine and Office of the Prosecutor General, and to international organizations such as International Criminal Court. So we're about to hand over all that information to further on identify that those were crimes against humanity if that fact will be concluded by the international institutions. But the main question, Ms. Nataliya, do you think we would be able to bring all the perpetrators to liability? So let's put it so, everybody, the law enforcement system, everybody who works in the fields, will take all the efforts to make it happen. Because you know, the representatives of the civil society and law enforcement system from different sides, they say that they're ready to cooperate, to exchange information, to make sure that our effort is focused on punishment of the Russians. Thank you very much. I want to thank you for this conversation. I want to thank our women. I want to thank you for sharing your horrific memories, and thank you for holding on. I hope that every terrorist, every perpetrator who commits those crimes against our people will be brought to liability eventually. We want to thank our armed forces and work together for our victory. Stay tuned, and glory to the heroes.